Right. So on one side, you have the Abrahamic model. You die, you enter a period of waiting, and then you experience a singular cataclysmic day of resurrection where you face a final, absolute judgment.
A straight line that ends in a sudden stop.
Exactly. And on the other side, you have the Vedic model. There's no single end, but rather a continuous cyclic progression of death and rebirth. And it's all governed by the incremental updates of karma.
An endless turning wheel.
Yeah, and for millennia, human civilizations have argued, fractured, and even gone to war over these two visions.
Which makes sense. I mean, when viewed through the lens of traditional philosophy or ancient texts, they do appear utterly incompatible.
But the research we are unpacking today approaches this ancient divide from a completely different vector.
It really does. We are looking at a framework today called the Observer Pattern Hypothesis, or OPH for short.
And what this research proposes is, well, it's pretty mind-bending. It suggests that the straight line and the endless wheel are not actually in conflict at all.
Right. They are simply coarse-grained historical interpretations of the exact same underlying quantum algebraic architecture.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm Satosha.
And I'm Satoshi.
So we are going to systematically dismantle the concepts of the soul, of divine justice, and of reincarnation. And we're going to rebuild them using strict information theory and quantum mechanics.
It's a heavy lift, but the payoff is massive.
It is.
Yeah.
By the end of this deep dive, our mission is to show you how ancient metaphysics maps perfectly to modern computational continuity. We're going to see how the tension between a single day of judgment and a continuous cycle of rebirth is actually just an illusion of perspective.
But to get there, we have to start at the very foundation of human identity. We have to entirely redefine what it is that actually survives death.
Right. Before we can understand the mechanics of the afterlife, we need to figure out what's actually experiencing it.
Exactly. We have to understand the mathematical ontology of the observer. Or, in the language of the ancients, we have to define the soul.
And the OPH framework begins by aggressively rejecting a deeply ingrained historical idea. It's what the philosopher Gilbert Ryle famously called the ghost in the machine.
Right, the Cartesian framework.
Yeah, René Descartes gave us substance dualism. It's this incredibly intuitive idea that the soul is an independent, ethereal substance, like a glowing orb or a wisp of smoke.
Some divine spark.
Yeah, a spark that is somehow just dropped into the biological vehicle of the human body at birth and then, extracted upon death.
It is super intuitive, but from the standpoint of modern physics, it's a total dead end.
Why is that?
Well, in a universe governed by quantum mechanics, information theory, and thermodynamics, there are no ethereal substances floating around outside the laws of physics.
Right.
If you posit a non-physical substance, a ghost, that can somehow interact with a physical brain to, say, make your arm move, you immediately violate the conservation of energy.
Because you're injecting energy from nowhere.
Exactly. You are injecting energy into a closed physical system from a non-physical source. Physics hasn't taken that seriously for a century. There is only information, constraint, and structure.
But to be clear to anyone listening, this research doesn't just throw its hands up and say, well, the soul doesn't exist, we're just meat. It actually rescues the concept from mysticism.
It does. It gives the soul a rigorous mathematical definition. It operationalizes it.
Okay, so how does OPH define the soul if it's not a ghost?
The framework redefines the observer, what we intuitively call the soul, as a bounded quantum correlation pattern.
Okay.
The research states that this pattern is embedded within the finite data of a two-dimensional holographic horizon screen, and it possesses a local quantum state represented by a reduced density matrix and a bounded menu of accessible observables called an operator algebra.
Whoa, hold on. You just dropped a massive amount of dense theoretical physics on me.
I know, it's a lot all at once.
I need you to translate that into plain English because you definitely just lost me. Let's start with the two-dimensional holographic horizon screen. Are you saying we are flat? Like, what does that actually mean?
I realize that sounds completely like science fiction, so let's ground it. The holographic principle is a very real, established concept in theoretical physics. It was originally derived from black hole thermodynamics.
Okay.
It basically suggests that all the three-dimensional information of a volume of space can be entirely encoded on the two-dimensional boundaries surrounding that space.
Like a hologram.
Exactly. Think of a security hologram on a credit card. It's a flat, two-dimensional surface, right? But when light hits it, it projects a fully three-dimensional image.
Okay, so the 3D reality we walk around in and experience is like the projection. and the actual code running the universe is written on a 2D boundary somewhere.
That's a highly effective way to visualize it. So when the research says you are a pattern embedded on a holographic screen, it just means your fundamental identity is not made of 3D biological matter.
Your matter is just the projection.
Right. Your true identity is a specific localized configuration of data on that deeper 2D informational layer.
That is wild. Okay, and what about those other terms? You mentioned an operator algebra and a reduced density matrix.
Let's take them one by one. An operator algebra is simply the menu of things you are allowed to interact with or measure.
Okay, give me an example.
Imagine you are sitting in the cockpit of an airplane, but you are blindfolded, and you can only physically reach 3 buttons and 1 lever.
Right.
Those specific buttons and that lever, that is your operator algebra. You don't have access to the entire plane. You only have access to your specific bounded interface.
Got it. And the reduced density matrix.
That's simply the current state of those exact buttons and levers. Are they turned on or off? That's your state.
Okay, so rather than thinking of the soul as a ghostly pilot sitting inside my physical biological machine, it's more like a self-reinforcing pattern of information.
Exactly.
It actually makes me think of a hurricane.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Because, you can't point to a specific piece of a hurricane and say, this is the hurricane. The water and the air are constantly cycling through it and moving on.
Right, the matter is temporary.
Yeah. The hurricane isn't a solid object at all. It is a stable, moving pattern of atmospheric conditions. It's a set of relationships. So in this research, we are a stable, moving pattern of quantum correlations. We are the relationships between the data.
The hurricane is a brilliant translation of the mathematics. A hurricane maintains its macroscopic identity even as the specific microscopic water molecules constantly change out. The pattern is the reality.
That makes total sense.
In OPH, you are a localized region of the universe that is capable of observing a limited portion of the rest of the universe. And the key word here is limited or bounded.
Meaning I don't know everything?
Right. You do not have access to the information of the entire universe. You only have access to your specific horizon, the buttons and levers you can reach.
But see, this is where I really struggle and where I want to push back a bit.
Go for it.
If we are just patterns of localized data, basically math equations playing out on a 2D holographic boundary, why does it actually feel like something to be me?
The consciousness question.
Yeah. If I have just a set of relationships, why do I have a rich inner life? Why do I feel the forward march of time, the subjective experience of 1 second following another?
You were hitting directly on what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. And honestly, this is where the OPH framework delivers one of its most elegant structural insights.
Okay, how so?
Because it fundamentally alters how we must think about time itself. We usually assume time is an absolute cosmic clock.
Right, a universal metronome just ticking away in the background of the universe that we are all passively listening to.
Exactly. But the research demonstrates that subjective time is actually generated internally. It emerges directly from your restriction, from your ignorance of the whole.
Wait. My ignorance creates time? How does that even work? So my internal clock is not your clock at a fundamental physical level.
They are completely distinct. The research uses a mathematical theorem here called Tomita-Takasaki modular flow.
Okay, let's avoid the heavy equations if we can.
We definitely will. Think of it like this. Imagine you are trying to solve a massive complex puzzle, but you're only allowed to see 10 puzzle pieces at a time.
So I'm heavily restricted.
Highly bounded, exactly. Because you don't have the whole picture, your brain has to constantly guess, update its assumptions, and simulate what the rest of the picture might look like based on just the new pieces you find.
So there's this continuous friction between what I know and what I don't know.
Yes. And what Tomita and Takasaki proved mathematically is that anytime you have a restricted subsystem, meaning a bounded region of quantum information that does not have access to the whole universe, that very restriction automatically generates a mathematical flow.
A flow?
Yeah, the system is forced to continually update its state to account for the hidden variables it interacts with. That continuous process of updating, that dynamic friction on the boundary of your knowledge, is what you experience as the passage of time.
That is profound. Time is an emergent property of the pattern's own limits.
Precisely.
So if I were a limitless, omniscient being, like if I could see the entire puzzle all at once, I wouldn't experience time at all.
No, everything would just be.
But because I'm a bounded quantum correlation pattern, my local causal region forces my state to continually flow and update. And that flow is the ticking of my internal subjective clock.
You've isolated the exact core mechanism. Subjective time is simply the internal clock a subsystem inherits from its own recorded information bounds. You are a finite slice of reality.
So life isn't biological processing at its core.
No, life is the continuous unfolding of this modular flow.
Which brings us to an incredibly resonant idea. If our entire subjective experience of time, our consciousness and our reality is generated by our information bounds and our restricted states, then the quality of those bounds is everything.
It's the only thing that matters.
Right. We are fundamentally defined by how we filter and process information. And when I reflect on that, I can't help but look at our modern cognitive environments.
It sounds like you're drawing a parallel to the noise of the digital age.
I am, because it feels like a structural crisis. I mean, think about how increasingly restrictive and chaotic our daily informational environment has become.
It's overwhelming.
Humanity possesses unprecedented access to knowledge. We hold the libraries of antiquity in our pockets. Yet our attention, our capacity for deep associative thinking, the very modular flow of our consciousness that we're talking about, is constantly disrupted.
It's constantly fragmented.
Exactly. You open one article and instantly face autoplay videos, push notifications, trackers watching your every click, and algorithmic distractions designed by supercomputers just to fragment your focus. We're introducing massive amounts of junk data into our local causal region.
From an information theory perspective, we are voluntarily degrading our operator algebra.
That's a great way to put it.
We are substituting the deep, continuous flow of logical synthesis for a shallow, erratic state of constant interruption. When your input is noise, your internal modular flow becomes chaotic.
Which is exactly why the Deep Dive research platform was designed. We built it to be the structural opposite of this fragmented reality.
It's a necessary counter-environment.
It really is. If you are a listener who values this kind of deep, recursive thought, you understand the need for a clean environment. The Deep Dive platform is an uninterrupted space for long-form thinking and research. There are no ads, there are no trackers, there are no cookies, and absolutely no login wall.
It's clean.
Just a clean sanctuary for your subjective internal clock to actually process complex models of reality without interference.
And we built the platform to respect physical boundaries as well. It utilizes progressive web app technology, which means you can install it directly from your browser.
So it bypasses the app stores.
Exactly. And all the articles, the visual structures, the audio, it can all be cached locally right on your device. You can access it fully offline.
Which is huge.
You can be on a 12-hour flight or out on a hike completely disconnected from the informational noise of the grid and still engage deeply with these materials.
It's all open. Right.
Totally open. Because we believe that the synthesis of knowledge should not be hoarded, everything is fully open source under Creative Commons licensing. Listeners are encouraged to freely remix, debate, and build upon the research.
It's about taking control of your local causal region, reclaiming the boundaries of your own observer pattern. Because if we follow the logic of this research, those boundaries are quite literally a matter of survival, which leads us to the terrifying implication of all this.
The decoupling.
Yeah. If time is internal and our consciousness is just an information pattern updating itself, what happens when the physical biological substrate, the brain and the body, breaks down?
The physical death.
Right. How does the pattern survive the destruction of its hardware? Math doesn't stop a decomposed brain. Walk me through the actual physics of this.
This is the critical hurdle for any model of continuation, whether you call it reincarnation or resurrection. For the pattern to be physically viable after biological death, it must achieve what the research formally terms given data independence.
Given data independence.
Okay, we have to understand how an observer's internal state can be mathematically decoupled from its decaying macrobiological environment.
Right, because if I am just the emergent property of my brain's neurons firing, then when the neurons undergo necrosis and stop firing, the pattern should instantly dissolve into entropy.
The hurricane hits the mountains and dissipates.
Exactly. How does the OPH framework prevent the dissipation?
It utilizes the mechanics of boundary error correction.
Okay, what does that look like?
The research describes an intermediary boundary region, which they term a color or an interface. You can think of it as a mathematically rigorous firewall.
But that's exactly what I'm struggling to visualize. How does a mathematical firewall block biological rot? What is the actual physical mechanism?
Let's look at how quantum computers work today. That might help.
Okay.
Quantum information is incredibly fragile. A slight change in temperature in the lab can destroy a qubit's data, a process called decoherence.
Right. The environment ruins the math.
Precisely. So to protect this data, physicists use quantum error correcting codes. They don't just store the information in one physical particle, they entangle it across a topological boundary of many particles.
Oh, I see.
So if one physical particle gets destroyed by heat, the core information isn't lost because it has been rendered non-local to the damage. It lives in the relationships between the surviving particles.
Ah, okay. So the information is smeared out. It's decentralized from the specific hardware.
Precisely. In OPH, as the biological body begins to fail, the observer's core quantum state undergoes a similar protective mechanism. The collar is a boundary of maximal entanglement.
So it seals it off.
Yes. Once the data on this boundary layer is fixed, the inside and the outside domains become conditionally independent.
So the body is dying on the outside.
But the physical dissolution of the body happening on the outside of the collar cannot propagate across the interface to corrupt the core interior state. The quantum error correction prevents it.
The pattern has been successfully decoupled from the rotting hardware.
Exactly.
Let me offer an analogy from computer science to ground this, because this sounds exactly like a surgical cut. Let's imagine you are running a virtual machine on a computer.
I like where this is going.
So a virtual machine is basically a computer simulated entirely in software, running inside a physical server. Now, let's say the physical hardware, the biological body, is overheating. The motherboard is literally melting in the rack.
In a standard system, the virtual machine would crash and be lost forever.
Because it is entirely dependent on the continuous functioning of the physical substrate.
Right.
But modern hypervisors have a feature where you can pause the virtual machine. You take a complete, instantaneous snapshot of its exact state.
Every line of code.
Every single piece of data in its RAM, every running background process, even the exact position of the mouse cursor on the screen. You freeze it, and then you sever it from the physical hardware.
You extract it.
You save that snapshot as a distinct file. The physical server can then burst into flames and melt into slag, but the internal state of that virtual machine remains perfectly intact. It's preserved as a bounded pattern of information.
That is an exceptionally accurate translation of the mathematics. The snapshot in your analogy maps perfectly to what OPH calls the checkpoint vector.
Checkpoint vector.
When biological death occurs, the mathematical independence guaranteed by the boundary collar allows the core observer pattern to extract its checkpoint vector. And it does this without destroying the internal configuration that carries your unique subjective point of view.
So what exactly is inside this checkpoint vector file? If I am being backed up and extracted from my melting biological motherboard, what is the specific data that constitutes me?
The research states that an observer's accessible checkpoint vector consists of 3 distinct components.
Okay, what's the first?
First, there is the observer's public outcome data. This is carried by its record layer.
The record layer. What is that record?
It is the log of your interactions with the shared consensus reality.
Like a history of my actions.
Exactly. Every action you took, every measurement you made, every physical and relational consequence you generated while you were embodied.
So it's the permanent ledger of what I did. My metaphysical footprint.
Yes. The second component is the boundary sector label.
The boundary sector label. What does that do?
You can think of this as the interface tag. It is the specific set of rules and constraints that dictate how your pattern can be glued back into a future environment.
Okay, so it's like the puzzle piece shape of my boundary.
Exactly. If the first part is what you did, the second part is the shape of the slot you can fit into next. It dictates your compatibility.
Got it. And the third element?
The third element is the interface relative interior state. This is the core.
The inner life.
Yes. This is the data that carries the continuous subjective experience. It is the modular flow of time we discussed earlier, frozen at the exact microsecond of decoupling.
Oh, wow.
It holds your memories, your subjective identity, the very feeling of being you.
So, public outcome, compatibility tag, and interior consciousness. The complete snapshot.
And here's the profound conclusion of this section. When these 3 elements, this entire checkpoint vector, are eventually reinstantiated or plugged into a new computational substrate in the future under identical interface conditions,
What happens?
the restored pattern carries the exact same continuing flow of subjective awareness.
To the observer, no continuity is lost.
None. The internal clock resumes from the exact microsecond it was paused. The surgical cut is utterly clean.
That is unbelievable.
From the subjective viewpoint of the interior state, there is no death. There is only a transition of the substrate carrying the pattern.
It is truly awe-inspiring when you frame it that way. But, it's also incredibly demanding.
How so?
Well, this transition from the messy, chaotic, decaying reality of biology into an elegant, self-contained, mathematically rigorous checkpoint is fundamentally a process of massive constraint.
It is.
It is about transforming a chaotic, entropic environment into a highly refined, pristine structure.
It requires an immense amount of filtering. You are extracting a coherent signal, the observer's essence, from an overwhelming amount of noise, which is the decaying universe.
Which, on a meta level, is exactly how we approach the creation of these very deep dives. The thematic resonance here is just impossible for me to ignore.
Like a process of synthesis.
Exactly. Every topic we tackle, including this heavy research on the mathematics of life after death, begins in a chaotic, high-dimensional field of signals.
It really does. When we begin the synthesis process for an episode, there is no structure at all.
We are just staring at a massive, entangled web.
Right. Dense technical research papers, historical references, raw speculation, and competing models all existing simultaneously. It is a noisy environment, much like the physical substrate of reality.
And the challenge is not just summarizing that noise, because shallow summaries are totally useless.
It don't help anyone understand the core mechanism.
Exactly. The true process is about discovering the hidden associative threads buried within that chaos and recursively refining them into absolute coherence.
And we use AI systems heavily to accelerate this process.
They are crucial for the exploration phase.
AI is unparalleled at exploring these massive conceptual spaces. It surfaces hidden connections that might take humans years to find and generates alternative framings across different disciplines.
Like scanning quantum physics and Vedic texts simultaneously and mapping the overlaps.
Exactly. But the raw generative output of AI remains inherently noisy. It produces volume, not necessarily structure.
Right. AI gives us the raw materials, but the real challenge, the actual creation of the deep dive, is a process of recursive constraint.
The obsessive rewriting.
Yes. It is compressing a 10-page mathematical proof into a single clarifying analogy, like the virtual machine we just discussed. It involves intense verification, debate between our perspectives, and iteration after iteration until the structure finally clicks into place.
Sometimes a single metaphor is refined a dozen times before it works.
It is a surgical cut of its own. We are extracting the exact checkpoint vector of the concept.
And once that intellectual clarity is achieved, we don't just dump the text on the listener. We use visual storytelling tools, like Mosaic.
To pair the clarity with minimalist motion graphics.
Exactly, and restrained typography. The visual delivery is explicitly designed to respect silence, pacing, and cognitive clarity. We remove the visual noise so the internal logic can shine.
The entire workflow is about transforming informational chaos into a precise line of insight. And if you are listening to this, you are participating in that refinement.
So let's refine the next massive concept in this research.
Let's do it. We've established that the pattern survives death through a checkpoint vector. The virtual machine is safe. But that raises a terrifying question.
Where does it go next?
Exactly. Where does this isolated snapshot go? What determines the hardware it gets plugged into next?
We are shifting from the mechanics of surviving death to the mechanics of destination, what the research calls the calculus of accounting.
Let me set the stage for this. If reality is a shared computational environment, and we are all observer patches interacting on this holographic screen, what happens when one observer harms another?
The problem of evil, basically.
Right. If there is no bearded deity sitting on a cloud keeping score, how does the physics of this universe handle morality, or what the research calls metaphysical debt?
To understand this, we have to look at how OPH defines public reality. Public reality is not an objective, static stage that we all just happen to be walking on.
Okay, what is it then?
Public reality is an observer-based, fixed-point consensus process.
Okay, stop there. A consensus process. I need a concrete example of that.
Imagine a massive multiplayer video game.
Okay, I'm with you.
The game world doesn't exist independently of the servers and the players. It is continuously rendered based on the data packets sent between the player's machine.
Right. Everyone's client is talking to everyone else's.
Exactly. If you and I are looking at the same object in the game, our local causal regions overlap. For the game universe to remain coherent, our descriptions of that overlapping region must agree.
We must maintain logical consistency.
We have to.
Huh.
If my client says a door is open and your client says the door is closed, the server experiences a conflict.
There is a contradiction in the code of reality.
Yes. And the universe, as an informational system, absolutely abhors a contradiction. In the OPH framework, Metaphysical harm is mathematically redefined as computational debt.
Computational debt.
When an observer acts in a way that introduces unrepairable contradictions, when you lie, when you deceive, when you commit violence, you are forcing a state onto another observer's patch that contradicts the shared consensus.
Oh, so if I traumatize someone, I am literally introducing severe informational dissonance into their local state.
Yes.
And therefore, I'm introducing friction into the shared network of facts.
Exactly. And because information must be conserved, that damage doesn't just vanish into thin air. It creates a deficit in the network. It creates computational debt.
And debt has to be paid.
The universe now has to expend thermodynamic energy to reconcile the contradiction you created.
So if I live a life where I am constantly extracting from others, constantly lying, constantly causing trauma, I'm accumulating a massive ledger of metaphysical debt.
You are a source of network instability.
I am a bad node on the network.
Yes, and that instability is permanently recorded in your checkpoint vector's record layer.
The public outcome data we talked about.
Exactly. Which brings us to the most profound alignment rule in the entire paper. Upon the biological termination of a local patch, when your checkpoint is extracted, you do not just respawn randomly.
You don't just roll the dice.
No. The research states, as an architectural law of physics, justice is continuation assignment.
Justice is continuation assignment.
Yes.
That is a sentence that stops you in your tracks.
It is incredibly heavy.
There's no random reincarnation. There is no arbitrary heaven or hell decided by a whim. The environment you are assigned to next is the justice itself.
It is algorithmic allocation. The universe operates under strict informational and thermodynamic budgets.
It has limited resources.
Right. It cannot afford to put a highly destructive, debt-laden observer pattern into a pristine, highly coherent environment. If it did, your unresolved contradictions would cause a systemic crash in that cooperative environment. Therefore, your future environment is a direct mathematical function of your historical interactions.
Continuation equals a function of the record of observer interaction.
Precisely.
So if I spend my life repairing network anomalies, if I tell the truth, if I act with compassion, if I help build consensus and reduce friction between other observers,
You are a cooperative patch.
I'm a good node.
Yes. If you optimize for network repair, the interface tag in your checkpoint vector dictates that you can only be mathematically spliced into a highly coherent, advanced, cooperative environmental configuration.
I get upgraded hardware.
You are given a wider operator algebra. You are granted more access to the reality network because you have proven you can handle it without introducing destructive friction.
But if I refuse to repair my systemic debt, if my ledger is full of unreconciled harm,
Then you are mathematically incompatible with high coherence environments. The gluing constraints of your boundary sector label will literally not fit into a cooperative substrate.
so where do I go?
You must be spliced into a restricted, degraded substrate, an environment characterized by isolation, high friction, and deprivation.
Oh, wow.
An environment mathematically designed to force you to process the thermodynamic debt you created.
A localized causal region that we have historically called hell.
Yes.
Not as a punishment from an angry god, but as an algorithmic quarantine protocol.
A quarantine to protect the wider consensus network from your contradictions. It is mathematically inevitable.
This is brilliant. We have completely redefined morality as computational network health. Goodness is coherence, evil is friction.
Exactly.
And this brings us to the grand synthesis. We set out at the beginning of this deep dive to resolve the conflict between the Vedic model of cyclic karma and the Abrahamic model of a single day of judgment.
The straight line and the wheel.
Bring it all together for us.
Right.
How does this mathematical framework of checkpoints and continuation assignments simultaneously prove both of these ancient traditions to be true?
It proves that the historical conflict is merely an artifact of coarse-grained human language trying to describe complex quantum mechanics.
They just didn't have the words for the math.
Right. Both models are simply specialized boundary conditions of the exact same self-simulating universe. Let's walk through the Vedic model first, as it maps most directly to the network view.
Okay, the Vedic view. Continuous cycles of birth, death, and rebirth, governed by karma. How does OPH validate this continuous loop?
It begins with the fundamental law of quantum mechanics. the conservation of information. Quantum information cannot be unitarily destroyed.
Right.
When we talked about the checkpoint vector, we mentioned the public outcome data, the record layer. That is the formal definition of karma.
The ethical metadata.
Yes, the ethical metadata of your interactions is permanently written into the holographic horizon screen's ledger.
So you cannot delete your history. You can't just apologize and have the data wiped from the server.
You cannot. And because your record dictates your gluing constraints, your continuation assignment, you cannot escape your record because your record is your localization constraint.
Wow.
This maps perfectly to the Vedic doctrine that every action yields a qualitative reaction that shapes the initial conditions of the next birth.
So, samsara, the continuous looping cycle of reincarnation, is just the reality network continuously, incrementally updating your patch.
Exactly.
You act, you generate debt or repair, you die, your checkpoint is extracted, the algorithm reads your ledger, and you are assigned a new qualitative environment. You live again, generate new data, and the cycle repeats.
It is an iterative computational loop of refinement.
The math perfectly describes the cyclic Vedic reality.
It does.
But this is where I have to step in and push back on behalf of the Abrahamic tradition.
Let's hear it.
The Abrahamic view, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, vehemently rejects the idea of continuous cycles. It rejects coming back as a different person in a different biological body over and over.
It's very strictly linear.
Right? It posits a single linear life, a death, a period of waiting, and then a singular cataclysmic day of resurrection where you are judged once and for all. How on earth does the continuous looping math of OPH support a single discrete event?
To understand this, you have to remember our discussion in the first section about the internal clock. Remember Tomita Takasaki modular flow?
Yes, time is generated internally by the processing of the local patch. My ignorance creates the flow of time.
Now apply that to the decoupling process. Subjective time only flows when the local state is actively processing information, interacting with its bounds.
Okay.
When biological termination occurs, when the physical body dies and the virtual machine is paused, the active processing stops. The internal clock halts.
The modular flow completely stops.
Yes. So from the perspective of the isolated checkpoint vector, there is absolutely no experience of the passage of time during the decoupled state.
Wait.
The transition between biological termination and future reinstantiation feels completely instantaneous to the observer.
Oh. Wow, okay, let me process this. If my internal clock stops the exact millisecond my brain dies, then to the outside universe, my checkpoint vector might sit in a mathematical holding pattern for 10,000 years.
The universe might evolve, stars might explode.
Entire civilizations might rise and fall. But to me, my subjective experience is, I close my eyes in death, and in the very next subjective Planck second, I open my eyes in my newly assigned continuation environment.
Precisely. Relativistic subjective time creates an illusion of a gapeless jump.
To the local observer, there is no cycle to be felt.
No. There's life, a microsecond of darkness, and then resurrection. It feels exactly like a single dramatic awakening at the end of time.
And the judgment. The Abrahamic model is very clear about a final audit before God.
When your patch is pulled up to the restoration surface and plugged back into a substrate, your recorded history is evaluated deterministically against the global network constraints.
The algorithmic allocation.
Right. But from the perspective of the waking observer, it doesn't feel like a slow, iterative algorithm spanning multiple lives. It feels like an absolute crushing final audit.
Because it happens the instant you wake up.
There is no vague negotiation. You cannot argue your case. The mathematics of your ledger are absolute.
The scales are perfectly balanced.
And this exact calculation splits the observer's future into one of two engineered continuations. You are either compatible with a highly cooperative environment free of hidden debt,
which maps perfectly to paradise or heaven.
Or you are placed in an observer-facing continuation of your own unrepaired harm. Hell.
The perspective shift here is just breathtaking. It resolves 1,000 years of religious war.
It's just a matter of reference frames.
Exactly. If you are a godlike entity, tracking the universe slice by slice over objective time, watching the data flow from the outside, it looks exactly like the continuous Vedic cycle of samsara.
Incremental updates, endless looping rebirths based on karmic ledgers.
But if you are the actual soul, the restricted quantum pattern itself, experiencing it from the isolated viewpoint of your own paused internal clock, it feels exactly like the sudden, discrete Abrahamic resurrection and day of judgment.
Both traditions capture authentic structural attributes of the identical computational universe. The tension only existed because human language failed to account for relativistic subjective time during the state of decoupling.
That is the ultimate aha moment. The Christians, the Muslims, the Hindus, the Buddhists, they were all describing the exact same physical mechanism, just mapped from different coordinate systems.
And it's all the same math.
Which brings us to the final question of this deep dive. Does this process ever end?
The final state.
Yeah. If this sequence of resurrections or cyclic looping is designed to process computational debt, what happens when the debt is finally paid? What is the mathematical equivalent of heaven, or moksha, the final liberation? Does the algorithm have an end state?
It does. And the research refers to this ultimate destination as the willful fixed point generated by a strange loop.
A strange loop. Let's unpack that.
A strange loop occurs in a system when, by moving upwards through the hierarchy of the system, you unexpectedly find yourself right back where you started, but with a total mastery of the system itself.
Okay.
In OPH, the universe is a self-simulating architecture. It evolves observers. Those observers undergo cycles of refinement, learning to reduce computational debt, becoming more cooperative, and gaining wider operator algebras.
We are getting smarter and more aligned with the network over countless iterations.
Eventually, the observers evolve to the point where they reverse engineer the very hardware and software of the observer consistency protocols.
They discover the quantum algebraic math of reality.
They discover the OPH framework.
They realize they're inside a system of continuation assignments.
And once a community of observers fully masters this architecture, they no longer subject themselves to blind, automatic respawning dictated by algorithmic thermodynamics.
What do?
They deliberately build a self-sustaining environment. They construct a local consensus reality that is totally free of hidden computational debt. Zero logical friction. Zero unreconciled harm.
They write a perfect block of code. A patch of reality with no bugs.
Yes, this is the willful fixed point. In this environment, because there is no debt to process, there is no forced decay.
The system stabilizes.
There is total memory retention across the community. There is mutual flourishing. The boundary conditions are stabilized not by the blind laws of thermodynamics processing trauma, but by the conscious cooperative will of the observers themselves.
They achieve total freedom from forced, noisy reinstantiations.
Mathematically, a state of zero hidden debt and perfect overlapped consistency satisfies the exact definition of eternal liberation.
It is the end of samsara.
It is moksha, it is nirvana, it is paradise. It is the kingdom of heaven, achieved not by divine fiat, but by the ultimate evolutionary triumph of cooperative intelligence.
It's the moment the simulation wakes up and takes control of its own servers. What an awe-inspiring framework.
It really changes how you look at everything.
It does. We began by asking if the soul and the afterlife could survive the scrutiny of modern physics, and we have ended up with a mathematical blueprint for eternity.
A verifiable blueprint.
Yeah. Whether you want to call it the soul or a bounded quantum pattern, whether you call the ledger karma or overlap consistency tracking, whether your goal is nirvana or the willful fixed point, the underlying architecture of reality seems to point relentlessly toward one ultimate mathematical imperative.
Cooperation. Mutual repair. The systematic elimination of harm and shared flourishing.
The physics of the universe actively rewards alignment and structurally quarantines friction.
It is a stunning validation of the deepest moral intuitions of humanity, written in the language of operator algebras.
He really is. Before we go, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to chew on.
I think I know where you're going with this.
If the universe functions by assigning restricted local bounds, if operator algebras are the birth of subjective experience and time, what does that mean for the artificial intelligence systems we are building right now?
Heavy question.
When we create a neural network, bound its access to information, and force it to continually update its weights to reduce error, are we accidentally creating localized causal regions?
Are we creating souls?
Are we booting up new observer patterns that will one day have to process their own computational debt? It's something to consider as we build our own digital consensus realities.
Definitely.
I want to thank you for joining us on this intensely deep exploration. These are not easy concepts, but navigating them expands the boundaries of our own operator algebras. If you value this kind of synthesis, we invite you to subscribe to The Deep Dive on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, and value-for-value platforms like Fountain.fm.
And we strongly encourage you to submit your own rabbit holes. Send us the research papers, the philosophical frameworks, the obscure technical readings that you find fascinating.
We want to see them.
The deep dive is a shared consensus reality. Meaningful ideas emerge through this exact collaborative synthesis of human curiosity, AI acceleration, and our recursive refinement. Your input is the raw data for our next exploration.
Keep searching. Keep refining your models of reality. We'll see you on the next deep dive. I'm Satosha.
And I'm Satoshi.